As you board, please move across your car to make room for everyone, and kindly offer available seating to those needing special assistance. If you're standing, please hold on to the handrails and stay clear of the doors. They will be closing in a moment. Thank you.
Welcome to another episode of Disney Assembled. I am Troy.
And I'm Mimi.
And we are your happy little father-daughter podcast, here to create joy and share our love for all things Disney. Well, Mimi, how are you doing? What did you do this week to get your Disney fix?
I watched Tangled again.
How many times have you seen Tangled?
I don't know. Like 12, I think.
I know you love Tangled. Is that like one of your favorites?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've
Definitely.
talked about Tangled a lot on the show and how much you love Tangled. Yeah, it's been a busy week for me. I guess there's a little bit of Disney news, but me personally, I got to watch a little bit of Disney Plus this week. Of course, listening to all the other wonderful Disney podcasts out there that we subscribe to, my way back and forth to work. But it's been a busy week for me, getting back into the swing of things more full time, like in my regular job. So. But Disney news, I thought there was a little bit of Disney news this week. Was there anything that really stood out in terms of Disney news? Not really much is standing out.
No,
is
not
there?
really.
Yeah. So things are holding pretty steady in the Disney parks and so forth. We covered the Mulan coming to Disney Plus last week. I guess the only other thing would be there's some new stuff on Disney Plus that's come out, The Greatest Showman. And
why do you say it like that?
Why do I say what?
Greatest Showman? What? It's Greatest Showman.
Well, there's a snowman and a showman.
No,
they sound alike.
That's not natural.
So
that's like not using conjunctions and saying it is or cannot.
Well, the showman is not appropriate. How should I say it?
Showman.
Showman?
Yes.
Like a shaman, but a showman.
A showman.
So the Greatest Showman.
Yeah. That's so unnatural.
Okay. Well,
Showman.
Showman. Whatever. All right. So that's about all the Disney news I have. Do you have any extra Disney news?
Not really.
Yeah, we're going to jump into our topic here in just a minute. But before that, of course, we have everyone's favorite, the Disney dad joke of the week.
Oh, boy.
Did you know, Mimi, that before you were born, your mother and I took a secret trip to Disney World right around Halloween time? And while I was there, I learned the secret to how to make your handkerchief dance.
How?
You put a little oogie boogie in it.
Oh. Okay. Haha.
So there you go. This week's Disney Dad Joke of the Week. Please save me so I don't have to come up with these on my own. Email us disneyassembled@gmail.com or shoot us a message on our socials with your own Disney Dad Joke of the Week. And we'll be happy to give you all the credit in the world for that particular joke. So, are you ready to jump into this week's topic?
Yep.
So, our listeners should know that we sat down and we've been trying to plan out topics for you and I to talk about.
We didn't really have like a topic. We were like lacking in ideas.
Well, we have a bunch of half ideas.
Yeah, like we didn't have enough time to like develop it fully.
Right. We have a bunch of ideas that we think are better ideas, but today we came up with one we thought is a pretty good idea, actually.
I came up with this one.
And you did come up with this one. And so all credit to you for this. I am a child of the 70s and 80s.
Mm-hmm.
You are a child of the 2000s.
Yeah.
And so decades matter. And when you look at Disney animated films over the decades, starting from 1937's Snow White, all the way through today, if you look at those films over time, there is a distinct sort of feel, look, tone to them as they move from the early years to modern times. So we thought it would be interesting to take a look at the Disney animated films through certain generational bunches
Yeah.
and have a discussion about the impact those films had on Disney overall and really maybe the impact that it has on Disney today, like how
Yeah.
we see it represented in sort of the ethos or the personality
Yeah.
of Disney as it exists
Or
today.
even like the parks and what stays popular. Because little girls still talk about Snow White, and it's been what, 70 plus years.
It's
So it's
been a long
like,
time.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we picked 5 movies from each of the different like categories, which we'll explain in a minute. And when it got to the 90s, it was really hard, but we picked 5 movies that we think best represent or the face of like it's essentially the most popular movies or ones that you have heard of from the era.
Right. And so this is how we broke it up. We have the 30s and 40s, the 50s and 60s, the 70s and 80s. The 90s had its own groups. There was so many to pick from. Then we have the 2000s, and then we have from 2010 to today.
Yeah.
And we just decided on 5 movies that we felt like, I think you just explained maybe, that maybe best represented that generation of films, right?
Mhm.
And so let's jump in. Let's get started with the 30s and 40s. So the 5 films we picked that we felt, and there weren't that many, right? I think there
Right.
were only maybe 5 main movies from the 30s and 40s. Well, Snow White and Seven Dwarfs, Fantasia, Pinocchio, Dumbo, and Bambi. And so when you think about those films, Mimi, what does it tell you about that era of Disney animation and what impact that has on Disney as it exists today?
Well, Snow White and Dumbo have their own individual like um themes in the park. Like you can see them in the park and even Pinocchio really with the dark ride. So I think people really appreciate that those movies because they're like classics. Like they're essential to knowing Disney. But I think if we were to talk about Fantasia, which isn't a traditional Disney movie, it doesn't have any words. It doesn't have it's not a very like kid-friendly character storyline. It's a movie about music and, brooms or mops or whatever they are. And it's like, it's not a traditional Disney film, but I think it's very important to include in the category. Like,
Right.
So like
Right.
what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that what Walt Disney was doing during that time was laying the groundwork and the foundation for the company going forward.
Yeah.
And so the stories, Snow White is a traditional tale. It's been around for a long time. It was a sure bet in terms of people understanding the story and having heard it before. Same thing with Pinocchio is an old story and so forth. So I think they were drawing on inspiration that they felt had a really good chance of connecting with audiences and showcasing the advancements in animation and filmmaking as they existed at that time. Fantasia was a little bit more pushing the boundaries, right?
Mhm.
And with many of these films, they didn't really make a profit until much, much later as they would kept being re-released. So
Yeah.
no, I think the 30s and 40s, to me, what it signifies is sort of the very classic, you know, Disney, sure bet animated films that you just can rely on, that you know what you're going to get and they're solid. And of course, Dumbo and Bambi, as you get into those films, they become all about, animal characters and not human
Yeah.
type characters, right? And so beginning to tell stories that don't include, main characters that are humans, um, but subscribing human characteristics to those animals was part of the storytelling. And so
Yeah.
when I think of
Definitely
the
like
30s and 40s, I just think of, hey, let's just watch an old classic and
yeah, like
and there you
definitely
go.
laying the groundwork and they haven't really hit their stride when it comes to music yet. It's like, like we do have some classic songs from Pinocchio and Snow White, but it's not the solid iconic Disney songs. We're not quite there yet.
Right. It was more about the storytelling, I think,
Right.
than the
This one was more
music.
about the showcase of animation and the storytelling. Yeah.
Right. And I think if there was a song that came out of that era that really stands out to me would be When You Wish Upon a Star from
Or
Pinocchio
I've got no strings.
or Got No Strings, right? So the 30s and 40s, again, just getting started,
Yeah.
new technology with animation, new styles, um, and really establishing Disney as a major studio for film production.
Yeah.
So we jump into the 50s and 60s. And do you want to read the 5 movies
Yeah.
that we
Okay.
picked?
So for the 50s and 60s, we have Cinderella, Peter Pan, Jungle Book, Sleeping Beauty, and Alice in Wonderland. There were some other really classic movies, iconic movies, but I feel like these represent the 50s and 60s because it shows how versatile Disney became
Right.
really fast.
And this is the time where, Walt's getting ready to build Disneyland in California, which opened in 1955. And so you see, some real, evidence of these films making a huge impact on the way Disney is even today. Sleeping Beauty's castle was built before Sleeping Beauty was even released as a film, right? It
Yeah.
was sort of part of the promotion of the film is to build Sleeping Beauty's castle in the park, and of course Cinderella was the first one. I think it came out actually in 1950. So Cinderella sort of straddles that, sort of is that link between, the 30s and 40s style moving into the 50s, which is going to be a little bit different style of animation.
hmm
And the look of it is a little bit different when you get into the 50s and 60s. And Cinderella sort of brought that into the forefront.
Yeah,
because it
like the
came out.
drawing style changes between the 40s and the 50s. And it's not super evident because it's a lot in the 50s and 60s we got a lot of human characters with the exception of maybe Jungle Book, whereas the 50s and 60s ended with Dumbo and Pinocchio or Pinocchio's human, but Dumbo and Bambi, and those are animal characters, and drawing animal characters in the same style as human characters, they look different.
And we start to see the interaction between human characters and animal characters in these films. So Cinderella with Jacques
Yeah.
and Gus Gus. You have Jungle Book with Mowgli and Baloo and Bagheera.
Yeah.
Even to some extent Alice, with the rabbit and
Yeah.
the different characters as she comes up. And Peter Pan, not as much maybe, but
But like different kind of characters,
different
like
feel.
not very traditional characters, not human, but this kind of like extra brand of human that we look as different. Mermaids, pirates, even the Lost Boys they are boys, but they're like presented as these like extra kind of majestic figure thing.
Of course. And then even again, I think this era is a big era for park influence.
Yeah.
Because
Oh yeah.
again, Cinderella's castle is the one in Disney World, right?
Mhm.
Sleeping Beauty's castle is the one in
Well, isn't it
Disneyland.
Belle's Castle now?
Well, Belle has one, I think, in the back. 'Cause
There's two?
in Fantasyland
Wait,
area.
I thought they just redid it. I don't know.
Well, they also start to see some impact on some of the dark rides here, right? Because you have like Peter Pan as a dark ride, you have Alice in Wonderland as a dark ride. Of course, Snow White is a dark ride in the other, from the other era. But the 50s and 60s, I think, was an interesting era because it became very, very popular. Television became popular.
Mhm.
Disney started to come on TV. And so this was a really influential era in terms of the animated films.
Yeah, like they kind of hit their stride in this sort of 2D animation style. They worked really well with color, especially in Alice. Yeah, this is kind of where your classic Disney starts to pick up, and Cinderella, Alice, Peter Pan. It's the classic that you can go back and watch over and over and over again.
No, lots of fun. And there's some other movies, like Mimi said, in the 60s and the 50s that we didn't pick that we enjoy watching a lot because they're sort of all in that same sort of
Yeah.
type of animation and storytelling, which is a lot of fun. And again, you see a lot of evidence of those in the parks and still in the Disney personality. Then we move into the 70s and the 80s. And this, in some ways, is an era that had some very high points, had a period where Disney was
Kinda
really
dipped,
struggling.
and then it came back up.
And then right at
Right.
the end of the 80s, sort of really beginning a new sort of renaissance of Disney animated
Yeah.
films. So the five we picked for this sort of era would be Fox and the Hound, Aristocats, Robin Hood, Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, and Little Mermaid. And of course, Little Mermaid coming out right at the end in 1989, right before that big 90s decade,
Right.
sort of signaling the beginning of a new.
Right, that movie can almost be wrapped into that like 90s era with Toy Story and Lion King and all these other movies.
But it wa-
Almost, but it came out in the 80s, so it has to be in like our 80s category, but it can almost fit in that same genre of film as the ones following it.
Absolutely. And of course, as I said in the beginning, I was a child of the 70s and the 80s. And so my perspective on this might be a little different than yours. And that is, I've always thought that Winnie the Pooh, Robin Hood, were solid. I love watching them, right? I think
Mhm.
Winnie the Pooh is one of my favorites. Robin Hood has a strong emotional connection to me because I just enjoyed watching that as a kid. But there were other films in there that just, I recognize them. I remember watching them. I remember them being fun, but I never felt the connection to them the way that I did to maybe Winnie the Pooh and Robin Hood, and maybe even some of the films that I'd watched that came out in the 50s and 60s. So
Mhm.
things like Aristocats, which I enjoy, but it's not the kind of film that I want to watch over and over and over again,
Right, like
right?
For me, Aristocats and Fox and the Hound and Robin Hood are good movies, but they didn't stick with me and resonate with me as much as Winnie the Pooh and Little Mermaid did.
Exactly. And there are other films during that era we didn't include that sort of all fit that same Aristocats feel. And then things sort of dropped off a pretty good amount. We included Fox and the Hound on here because there were any number of films that were made around the time that Fox and the Hound were released. And I included Fox and the Hound. I think we included this one because of all those films, it was the one that had the most emotional story to it.
Yeah.
The guy was trying to hunt the fox and kill the fox, and the dog had to, was it Copper and Todd, right? And
Yeah.
Copper had to save Todd at the end, and the bear. So we get. I think the important part of Fox and the Hound is it starts to create a story that is less about fun animated style,
Right, it's
more
less
that Don Bluth style that ended up going to a different studio, but it was a very emotional story. There was
right,
an
it
emotional
became
connection to it.
less and less, not to say that they're not about the storytelling and, the animation, but this Fox and the Hound is kind of the beginning of that era that of movies that have this emotional story that people really connect to and love. And I think Fox and the Hound is an underrated movie, but like it's hard to like my feelings for that movie are very complicated and I don't really have the words to express them.
And it's a part of the Disney animated movie lifeline, right? The timeline that we don't see a lot of evidence in the parks to this day. I mean, Winnie the Pooh is a strong character. It's still
Yeah.
very much a part of the Disney personality.
And Little Mermaid
And Little
too.
Mermaid, exactly. But other than those two, I mean, even like Robin Hood, which we've said before, I wish had a
A
stronger
great
representation in the
yeah.
park. None of those other films show up very much. I mean, you might see some of the Aristocats characters in Epcot. I know you met Marie,
Yeah.
but for the most part, these are characters that didn't translate well into a broader sort of personality of Disney. And I think that's intentional. I think
Yeah.
Disney recognizes this was not a period of time where the quality was up to what they would hope it would be,
Yeah.
and they had to recapture that magic.
Well, I wouldn't say quality. Like I think they're quality movies. I think it's just the popularity of these movies were so low compared to the 50s and 60s. Like come on, you can't follow Alice in Wonderland with Fox and the Hound.
Well, the tone was very different. It was less whimsical and more, I don't want to say darker, but the themes became
It was
less
sharp and
magical.
yeah, it was sharp and clean and crisp and less open to like the imagination of, getting to figure things out for yourself or wonder about things. Like cuz when you watch Alice in Wonderland, you leave the movie with questions.
Right. It
When you watch
didn't.
Aristocats, it's answered for
When you
you.
watch Fox and the Hound, there's not a lot of imagination that gets sparked through that movie,
Yeah.
right? You're just watching
That's
a
a sad
story
movie. Like
unfold.
that's a movie you watch when you're sad.
Well, hopefully you feel better when the movie's over. So then we jump into the 90s. And again, the 90s were powerful decades, sort of the
Definitely.
reemergence of Disney with strong presence. And so, Mimi, what 5 movies did we pick for the 90s?
All right, this one was so hard. Okay, but these are the 5 movies we have.
It was actually 6 because we
Yeah,
combined
it's 6.
2. Right.
Okay. Beauty and the Beast, Lion King, Aladdin, Hercules, Toy Story 1, and Toy Story 2.
Right. We lumped Toy
And
Story 1 and 2 together.
because Toy Story 2 is so good. It is the only Disney sequel I will actually allow myself to watch.
And I know on our list of topics one day we are going to talk about Disney's original stories versus their
Mhm.
sequels and so forth. But
I think
the
Toy
90s,
Story could
yeah.
be honestly its own episode. There's so much to unpack there, but I feel like the 90s is when Disney hit its stride in music. Like cuz the music picked up in the 90s. Okay? Yes, you have the Little Mermaid soundtrack, but that was the 80s and it's only one movie. But when you think about the 90s and look at this list. Beauty and the Beast. The songs in that movie are iconic. Hercules, that soundtrack is like nothing I've ever heard before. I love the Hercules soundtrack. Aladdin, Lion King, even Toy Story has some, songs.
Great music, yeah.
Right. Like I feel this is where they roped the music into the storytelling and less about having, albums to sell or an earworm or something. Like, it became about the story and less about the
And
music.
there's a reason a lot of these films translated well to the stage, and they had Broadway productions that came out
Oh
of
yeah.
them because they're just solid all around entertainment. It's a great
Right.
story, great characters, it has humor, it's got great music, it's got everything put in together. So if you look at everything up to this point, it's almost as if Disney decided, we've gotten away from the things that make Disney special, which is this joy and happiness and this feeling of just imagination and escapism.
Mhm.
And then they added an element of just taking the musical piece and adding it in there. And I think it's very obvious how this decade has a tremendous impact on the way Disney is seen today. I mean,
Oh
just turn
yeah.
on Disney Plus. I mean, the influence of this decade on the stuff that's available that's coming out new. I mean, all of the remakes, which again, it's another episode we have to talk about some of these remakes that are more quote live action.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I think the 90s in
Right.
contrast to the 70s and 80s, you couldn't have picked two totally different feels, those totally different impacts that those have on how
Right, like
Disney is today.
the impact of this era and these movies is it's the full package. It's emotional, it's great storytelling. The animation quality is out of this world. The music, everything about these movies is the full package. Now some of them are better than others and some of them are worse than others, but that's storyline. That doesn't have anything to do with the magic of the film. All of the movies coming out of the 90s had that Disney spark and everyone it's hard to not appreciate all of them.
And I think, up to this point, if you were at Disney and you're producing films, as much as each film, I know, from all reports, Walt was trying to make sure every film was sort of judged on the value of its own merit, not against any other film.
Right.
When you come out of the 30s and 40s and the 50s and 60s and the movies that we just mentioned, and you're trying to live up to a quality standard set by those films, over time, at some point, it's going to be very, very difficult to do so. And so,
Right.
what Disney did, I think, in the 90s was reset the bar for what people expected in terms of quality
Right.
animated film entertainment by the Disney company. They've totally said, we're going to start completely over and we're going to redefine what a great animated film that comes out of this studio feels like, looks like, and sounds like. And the
Right.
90s, I think, does that.
And with Toy Story 1 and 2, they started using that CGI animation style and less about the 2D, paper-esque. That's like a bad way to describe it
So
because I
the
don't
hand drawn.
the hand drawn, right. Like I don't really know what the art style is called, so like I'm just kind of talking. But in Toy Story we start seeing that CGI and then when we roll into the 2000s we see it a little more with our movies Up, Wally, Lilo and Stitch, The Incredibles, and Tiana. Or Prince and the Frog. I wrote down Tiana because it was easier.
So yeah, we move into the 2000s and we pick, again, very hard to pick five because there were some
Right.
great
This one was
films.
real hard.
But we did pick, like Mimi just said, Up, Princess and the Frog, Wally, Lilo and Stitch, and The Incredibles, and which is an interesting list because these films, in many ways, are very different
They are.
than what came in the 90s, but there is something about them that makes them can feel connected and really part of that same Disney personality. And so, why don't we go through that a little bit? I mean, I think when you look at Up, Up isn't really known for its music, but it's a fantastic story.
Right.
And
It's
it
known
really,
for like the story, right?
and it's known for the story
And
and
the
of course,
emotion.
and the emotion of it. So there's a connection. And of course, the 90s films had strong emotional components to them, as well as great music. Up continued, great story, sort of a different story that we've never seen before,
Yeah.
very different, and had a real connection. Wally, to me, is almost like, again, it's a different type of movie completely, but to me, it feels like the Fantasia type of movie for Pixar, where
Yeah.
they sort of went out the box and said, we're going to try something totally new here.
Yeah, we're
But
gonna
there's
try something
essentially
totally
no
weird.
dialogue. There's like no dialogue until way late in the movie.
Yeah.
And we're going to do something that is either going to connect or really turn people off.
And
they
it's
took a
going to
big
be
chance.
environmentally friendly. And it's going to help the world.
Well, it tells a great
Boom.
story, and it tells a different story, and it does so. It takes a chance. There was a big risk, I think, with
Right.
Wall-E
And
as a
people
story.
responded to it so well. People fell in love with Wall-E, and people fell in love with Eve. But yeah, you're right. There was that risk. Like, I could totally see if it was flipped. And like, I can, like I can picture it, what it would be like if people didn't respond to that movie well.
And both Pixar and Disney at this time are balancing what they're releasing. So when you have Wall-E, which is sort of this very different type of story, and you balance that with a movie like The Incredibles, which, again, not known for its music, but a different story
Right.
and a
And
really
we
fun
love
story,
The
right?
Incredibles.
So
love
one,
The Incredibles.
right? Incredibles,
10 out of 10.
again, a new idea, but there is a consistent feel to the storytelling and the connection with audiences.
Mhm.
What would you say about Princess and the Frog and Lilo and Stitch and how they fit into that?
Lilo and Stitch is so easy to get emotionally connected to. There's so many different ways to connect to it, but we connected through the Ohana and Stitch, and like I feel like that movie is very emotional, but it also has a really interesting story, really cool animation, really cool music. That movie kind of reminds me as of the 90s. It kind of has the full package. People don't like it, or people like it, but it's not as, iconic, I guess, as Beauty and the Beast or Lion King, but I think it fits the quality of those 90s movies. And then with Princess and the Frog, it's the last hand-drawn Disney film, right? Isn't that
Sort
what you
of, yeah,
said?
I think so. I'm not sure exactly,
Or
but
something
yeah.
like that. And it's a different story. Like, we've heard the tale, we've heard the Princess and the Frog, but the way that they told it is so different.
Right.
And people fell in love with it also because we have a princess of color finally. I don't know, it's just Princess and the Frog, the music, I don't know. Lilo and Stitch's Princess and the Frog kind of branched off of those 90s movies. The full package, emotional, music, animation is 10 out of 10. The story is great. It's like,
Well, what Princess and the Frog does is it takes inspiration from a tested story that is a proven known story.
Right.
Princess and the Frog is a story that's been around for a long time.
Yeah.
Aladdin, that story. The Lion King is a story that's been around. Beauty and the Beast has been around. These Little Mermaid, these are all stories that were known, and Disney did their own version of it. And Princess and the Frog is sort of, they said, okay, we've done this type of thing before. Let's try it with this story and let's see what we can come up with. And they did a great job of it.
Yeah.
Lilo and Stitch, sort of different thing. This is a new story, sort of new characters we're introducing.
But
This
it still
alien
had that
character,
quality of
and they mixed in
film.
this story about family, about children, about the struggles of family, and how they all come together in a joyful way. And so the 2000s has a nice mixture of very different storytelling going on.
Right.
But again, a common theme: quality art, quality storytelling. When music was needed, quality music, but not reliance on music for the sake of having the music. It could have very easily in the 2000s said, we just put out all these movies with great music. We better have fantastic music in all these films.
Yeah, but you
and they
didn't
didn't
need
do that.
music in The Incredibles. You didn't need music in Up.
They had the music to support the story. And I think that was the key, was the storytelling is the key. If it's a bad story, there's not much we can do about it.
Right, and I think they figured that out between the 80s and the 90s. And then from then on, it just kind of branched, and look where we are now.
And then you jump into from 2010 to today. And, again, we picked 5, but there were plenty of
This one
others to
was
pick
real
from.
hard.
This one was hard too. And so the 5 we picked were Tangled, Frozen, Brave, Coco, and Moana.
So they have this common theme of one-word movie titles.
One-word titles, yeah.
That's their new thing. Onward, Frozen 2.
Well, Frozen
theme.
2 is actually 2 words.
Well, yeah, but it's like it has a sequel.
Okay. So again, the 2010 to today feels a lot like the 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
Tangled, the story of Rapunzel, is a story that has been told for a while.
Right, and it's not called Rapunzel, which is like the first sign that it's different. It's different from the original story, but
Right.
it does still stay true to the elements of the framework of the original story.
Right. So Disney goes back to the well and says, let's take one of these very popular stories that are out there that we haven't done before, and let's do a Disney version of it. Let's see what Disney can do with the story of Rapunzel. Same thing with Frozen, was kind of taken off a lesser known sort of tale, right?
Yeah.
Of the Ice Princess. But again,
But the
how do
original
we?
story and Frozen are two very different things.
Well,
Like
they are very
they were
different.
inspired, but they didn't follow the original story like they did in, Lion King or Princess and the Frog. Like I don't know, it wasn't the same storyline, but it had the same like elements. I don't know. I read about that somewhere.
And then you have like stories like Coco and Moana. Again, great storytelling, new avenues of storytelling, different ethnicities, different settings,
hmm
different characters. Some of them are children, some of them are adults.
Solid music.
Solid music. So Moana and Coco and Frozen and Tangled.
Tangled has
Again,
such a good
going
soundtrack.
back to great storytelling, great animation, great music.
Yeah.
We got something to play with here. I mean, all of those could be on stage,
Yeah.
right?
But most of these are like, well, not Tangled, but Pixar films because Disney has not had an original film in a very long time. Disney, what you doing? Can you come up with a new movie?
Yeah, but I think Tangled, Frozen, Coco, and Moana were all Disney
Is
animated.
Moana not Pixar?
I don't think Moana's Pixar.
And I think Coco is Pixar because
Might
it came
be.
out in
Coco might be Pixar.
2017 or something.
Well, Brave is definitely Pixar.
Yeah, Brave is definitely Pixar.
And like, no music, but great storytelling.
Yeah.
And again, going back to the
And there's
difference.
that emotional connection with, it's about the story of a mother and her daughter. And so it's like I feel like with the movies that you can relate to and that are very emotional, they have less music and it's fine because you're already emotionally invested in the story, so you don't really need the music. Whereas the movies that are retellings of original stories or aren't as easy to get or to relate to, like Tangled or Frozen or even Princess and the Frog, they have the music kind of like carries, like fills that emotional connection whole thing.
Right. So I think what Disney has found since the 90s has been great characters,
Mhm.
good humor, good storytelling, fantastic animation, and where music can be used to connect with the audience we're trying to connect with. Let's write great songs. Frozen is a great example of that. Frozen is a great story. It's well animated. It's got funny characters. But the music is what
The music sells
ties
the
it
movie.
all together.
Yeah.
It brings it all together. One Frozen without the music would not be nearly as entertaining a story as it is with the music. So the music is
Yeah.
really important. Brave, if Brave had had a whole bunch of musical
I think
pieces,
that would have overkilled. And
well,
made
it wouldn't
the
have
story...
been. It may not have been aligned with the character because Merida, as a character, I don't picture running around the forest singing and dancing with
Mhm.
woodland creatures. Right? She was a different type of character, and they kept true to the characters that they were trying to use to tell the story.
Yeah.
Which I think is really important. So that takes us up to today. So we've covered the 30s and 40s, 50s and 60s, the 70s and 80s, the 90s, 2000s, and the 2010s to today. And we've sort of taken a look in general about our thoughts about how these decades, how these eras of Disney animated filmmaking has had an impact on us and on the way Disney is today. So why don't we wrap up with doing this, right? This discussion.
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting. You're a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
I am far from being a teenager. I think we probably have different perspectives on which era do we feel is the most impactful today and which one we have the strongest sort of connection to based on our own perspectives of life. So why don't you start? Give everybody the teenage perspective on
I
the
think
topic.
the 50s and 60s are the most impactful on the whole franchise because not only because of like merchandise and the park and all this other extra stuff, and it's not really about music either, it's about storytelling. The 50s and 60s is when Disney hit its point where storytelling became important. It wasn't about the animation. It wasn't about anything else. It was the storytelling. And how can you convey this story, this book, this something, and make it entertaining and fun and have likable characters? So, and like when you look at Cinderella and Peter Pan and Jungle Book and Sleeping Beauty, the storytelling is great. The quality of the film is not so great, but it's also been millions of years since the 50s and 60s, right? Like, I don't know. It's just something about that era that changed the rest of the franchise or the company, I guess. But the 70s and 80s did have a lull, but that's natural. Every company, every book series, everything's gonna have some kind of lull, right? And I think they just hit it in the 70s and 80s. But regardless, the 60s and the 50s are definitely the most impactful because they started that chain of thoughtful, interesting storytelling.
That's really interesting. I would not have thought you were going to pick the 50s and 60s. So that's very insightful, and it's well spoken, well thought out answer to that question. For me, as a child of the 70s and 80s, I'm going to go in a different direction. I'm going to go with the 90s as being the most impactful. And it's interesting because I don't find the movies in the 90s to be my favorites.
Hmm.
I really like them, but they're not my favorites. I would say my favorites are the ones from the 2000s to today, sort of the ones that we were mentioning, more
Hmm.
recent movies. But I think the 90s taught Disney something really important about how to move forward with their animated storytelling through animated movies.
Right.
Up to that point, I think there was a part, even if it was subconscious, of them trying to live up to this golden era of the 50s and 60s or the 30s and 40s. Like, how do we recapture what we did then? And
Hmm.
what the 90s did, I think, is say, okay, we get a new group of people in here. That is the wrong measuring stick. That is the wrong criteria for deciding on whether or not we're successful. We need to reestablish who we are as a studio in the lives of our fans, in the lives of the people who go to our parks. And how do we find sort of a formula to doing what we do that is translatable regardless of the story? And so the 90s sort of, I think, started that
Hmm.
with great storytelling, going back to familiar stories, retelling them in a Disney sort of way. So they say, okay, we're going to take this Beauty and the Beast story and we're going to make a Disney version of it. There was a good chance that we were going to watch it because they knew the story of Beauty and the Beast. So
Yeah.
they took inspiration from what Disney did in the 30s and 40s and said, let's bring this to the 90s, but do it in a way that feels modern. And so let's bring in the musical element. Let's bring in the comedy, pieces. Let's not be afraid, to break barriers, where characters are talking to the audience as opposed to just being stuck in their stories. Let's go there and let's start to tap into what we learned about the 70s and 80s. There's an emotional element. Toy Story 1 and 2 is extremely emotional.
Right.
I mean, there is a lot of pulling on the heartstrings there. I mean, even The Lion King, there are moments in there that are very emotional. So, how do we get this emotional element that we sprinkle into the story? Let's take this musical element, or let's be brave and tell a fantastic story with new characters that we can then introduce into the parks, introduce into our fans' lives,
Yeah.
and introduce them into sort of the lifeblood of the Disney universe going forward.
Yeah. They
So
have
I
this like Renaissance era.
Right, and that's why I think the 90s to me is probably the most impactful one in terms of the way Disney is
Right.
today.
Like they came up with a way to
I think it
do what they
clearly
do in full quality and people love it.
I think it clearly honors what was done in the 30s through the 50s
Yeah,
and 60s
definitely.
and learns the lessons they learned and apply those lessons learned into great storytelling, great animation, great entertainment for families going forward.
Yep.
Well, there you have it.
Yeah.
The Disney through the decades,
Yeah, through
Disney
the
through the eras,
decades.
the animated films. Of course, our listeners out there may have their own opinions about which decade or which era was the most impactful. They may also wish to include films we didn't include in our list of 5, which I'm sure they have their own connections to. And we would encourage them to reach out to us, shooting us an email at disneyassembled@gmail.com to let us know your thoughts. And before we wrap things up, we do want to give a shout out to our patrons over on Patreon. So thank you, Brenda and Danny, for continuing to support the show. If you would like to help us out by becoming part of our patron list on Patreon, go to patreon.com/Disney Assembled. Mimi and I have been discussing a really cool project that we want to start doing maybe with our patrons. We're looking at doing a live countdown show every weekend right before we drop this episode live as part of our patron content. But if you'd like to help us out, it's $5 a month. If you don't, no big deal. But we'd appreciate your consideration there, joining our patron group over on Patreon. If you're also feeling extremely thankful and really want to give us some support, head on over to our TeePublic store, check out the Disney Assembled merch there, and show us some love. And if those two things are not your bag, no big deal. Continue to listen to the show and connect to us on our socials account. Mimi, why don't you tell everyone how they can do that?
Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, all at Disney Assembled. We're mostly active on our Instagram, but we are active on our Twitter and Facebook as well.
And we also have a YouTube channel.
And our YouTube.
Yeah,
subscribe
so we're trying to
at Disney Assembled.
So if you're listening out there and you haven't subscribed to one of our socials, please do so. And if you haven't taken a few moments to go to our YouTube channel and hit subscribe, that would be great. We would love to get that custom URL on our YouTube channel soon. So help us out by subscribing to our YouTube channel. And of course, if you haven't done so and you are so motivated, we would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts, which we'll be happy to read here on the air and share with everyone. Well, Mimi, great conversation.
Yep.
Disney animated movies through the decades. I'm kind of feeling like going downstairs and checking out one of those films on Disney Plus, right? Yep. Maybe we'll do that. All right. Well, that'll wrap it up this week, and I guess that'll do. So until next time, see you real soon.